"Here's what's going to happen," Ezra announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "You and your men are going to get on your horses, ride out of Dust Creek, and never come back. In return, I won't tell the territorial marshal where to find you." It was an offer of mercy, a chance to end the bloodshed. But as Clara looked into Snake Eyes' eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than his violence. She saw the desperate, venomous cunning of a cornered animal. Even beaten, bleeding, and disarmed, he was still dangerous, still calculating. And that's when she realized the horrible, chilling truth. Ezra's mercy might be the very thing that destroyed them all. Snake Eyes' broken, bubbling laugh echoed off the false front buildings as he cradled his shattered wrist. "You think this ends here, soldier boy? You think mercy makes you the hero?" Ezra kept his gun steady, but Clara could see the war raging in his eyes. To kill Snake Eyes now would be an execution, making him a murderer in front of the very people he had just inspired. Yet, to let him live was to sign a death warrant for everyone who had stood against him. The outlaw would return, not with a handful of men, but with an army, and his vengeance would be biblical. "The girl," Snake Eyes continued, his voice gaining strength from its own malice, his eyes locking on Clara with a triumphant sneer. "Sweet little Clara there. You think saving her makes you noble? But you don't know what her daddy dearest really owed money for, do you?" Clara's face went white. A cold dread, separate from the immediate danger, washed over her. "Don't listen to him, Ezra. Please." But Snake Eyes pressed his advantage, blood flecking his lips as he grinned. "Tell him, darling. Tell him about the Chinese workers your papa sold to the mine owners. Information for cash. Tell him about the families that died in those tunnel collapses because your father told us which safety regulations were being ignored, which mines were death traps. He didn't just owe me for cards." The words hit Clara like physical blows. The shame was suffocating. Her father's gambling debts hadn't been about simple vice, they were payments for betrayal, for blood money. Innocent people, men with families, had died because of her father's greed and weakness, their lives traded for a few extra dollars to throw on a card table. "That's why she's here," Snake Eyes wheezed, his point made. "It's a blood debt. Her daddy sold souls, so now his daughter pays the price. That's frontier justice." The former sergeant's hand trembled slightly as the weight of this new, sickening revelation settled upon his shoulders. Behind him, he could hear the townspeople whispering, their newfound courage already wavering as the poison of Snake Eyes' words sank in. Doc Patterson stepped closer. "Son," he said softly, "sometimes mercy is just delayed justice." But Clara had heard enough. Her own shame was a fire in her belly. With tears of humiliation and grief streaming down her face, she walked into the open space between Ezra and Snake Eyes. "If my father's sins condemn me, then I'll bear that burden," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "But I won't let you become a murderer to save my life." She turned to face the town. "My father made evil choices, but that doesn't make this man's mercy wrong. Ezra Blackwood risked his life to give me a freedom I now know I didn't deserve. I won't let that sacrifice be poisoned by more killing." Snake Eyes' eyes narrowed, realizing the girl was thwarting his psychological warfare. "Noble words from a dead girl walking," he sneered. But Ezra had made his decision. He lowered his gun and stepped back, his voice imbued with a chilling finality. "You have 1 hour to collect your men and ride out. If I see your face in this territory again, mercy will not be an option." Snake Eyes' smile was pure poison as he struggled to his feet, helped by one of his now hesitant men. "You just signed everyone's death warrant, farmer. Sweet dreams." As the outlaw stumbled toward his horse, Clara watched his path, and a new, more immediate horror made her blood freeze. He wasn't heading toward the edge of town. He was heading straight for the small, clapboard building where the town's children were hiding. "The schoolhouse," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "All the children are hiding in the schoolhouse." Ezra spun around just as Snake Eyes, with a final, desperate burst of energy, kicked open the door of the small wooden building where Miss Henderson, the young schoolteacher, had taken shelter with 8 terrified children during the gunfight. The outlaw's good hand held a derringer he'd kept hidden in his boot, small, but deadly at close range. "New deal, farmer." Snake Eyes shouted, using his body to block the doorway, his silhouette a monstrous shape against the terrified faces within. "I take 1 kid with me as insurance. You follow, they all die. You let me ride out peaceful like, and maybe, just maybe, I don't paint these walls red." Through the open door, Ezra could see the tiny, pale faces pressed against the far wall. Tommy Wright's little sister, Sarah. The Patterson twins, their eyes wide saucers of fear. The preacher's boy, who couldn't be more than 5 years old. Miss Henderson stood in front of them like a human shield, her own face pale but her expression one of fierce, maternal defiance. "You're a special kind of evil," Ezra said, his voice a low, deadly quiet. Snake Eyes laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. He backed deeper into the schoolhouse, pulling a small child partially in front of him. "I'm a survivor. Something you're about to learn ain't the same thing as being a hero." The townspeople had gathered in a helpless crescent behind Ezra, but none dared move closer. One wrong step, one sudden movement, and innocent blood would spill across the rough-hewn floorboards of the schoolhouse. That's when Clara did something that stunned everyone. She started walking slowly, deliberately, toward the building. "I'll go with you," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "Take me instead. Leave the children. Take me and ride out. You get your prize, they get their lives." "Clara, no." Ezra grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. But she pulled free, her gaze locked on Snake Eyes. "This started because of my father's debts," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "It should end with me paying them." Snake Eyes considered this, his scarred face twisting as he weighed his options. The girl was worth more to him than a random child, and she was coming willingly. It was a tempting offer. But then, young Sarah Wright, barely 7 years old, with blonde pigtails and a dusting of freckles, stepped out from behind Miss Henderson's skirt. "Mister," she said, her voice small but clear, "you're hurt real bad. My mama says hurt people sometimes do mean things 'cause they're scared." The sheer, unadulterated innocence in her voice cut through the thick tension like a holy blade. Even Snake Eyes hesitated, his cruel gaze faltering as he looked down at this tiny girl who was showing him more compassion than he had likely received in his entire miserable life. "Sarah, get back," Miss Henderson whispered urgently. But the child continued, her small voice unwavering. "If you're scared, you can stay for supper. Mama always says nobody should have to face their troubles on an empty stomach." For one impossible, fragile moment, something human flickered behind Snake Eyes' cold, dead eyes. The little girl's guileless words had found a crack in the armor of hatred and cruelty he had spent a lifetime building around his heart. That moment of hesitation was all Ezra needed. He moved with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His damaged hand, the hand that had trembled in the saloon, was as steady as a rock as he drew and fired a single, precise shot. The derringer flew from Snake Eyes' grasp, clattering harmlessly to the floor. The outlaw collapsed, clutching a new wound in his shoulder, screaming in rage and pain. But as Ezra rushed toward the schoolhouse, he didn't notice Snake Eyes' final, spiteful act of defiance. His good hand, fumbling in his vest, pulled the pin from a small stick of dynamite he'd kept hidden for just such an occasion. "If I can't have this town," Snake Eyes wheezed, his face a mask of madness, "nobody can." The sharp, angry hiss of the burning fuse cut through the air like a death sentence. Ezra had maybe 5 seconds before the dynamite turned the schoolhouse into a tomb of splinters and corpses. "Everyone out. Now," he roared, diving through the doorway. Miss Henderson didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest children and shoved them bodily toward the open windows, where townspeople were already scrambling to pull them out. Ezra threw himself at Snake Eyes, trying to wrench the dynamite free, but the wounded outlaw clutched it against his chest like a precious treasure, his eyes wild with the nihilistic glee of a man determined to take everyone with him. 3 seconds, Snake Eyes whispered through a bloody-toothed grin. "Say your prayers, Sergeant." Clara appeared in the doorway. She took in the scene, Ezra struggling, the burning fuse, the children scrambling for their lives, and made a choice that stopped Ezra's heart. Instead of running, she lunged forward. She wrapped her arms around Snake Eyes' torso, pinning the dynamite between her own body and his. "If you want to kill children, you'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that must have been flooding her veins. 2 seconds. Ezra's mind, trained in the chaos of battle, raced through impossible calculations. He couldn't reach the dynamite in time. He couldn't pull Clara away without setting it off. But maybe, just maybe, he could change the direction of the blast. 1 second. With a surge of strength born of pure desperation, Ezra grabbed both Clara and Snake Eyes, a tangle of struggling bodies, and hurled all three of them toward the back corner of the schoolhouse, where the building's thick stone foundation rose a few feet from the ground. As they hit the floor in a heap, he twisted his body, instinctively trying to shield Clara from the blast with his own. Snake Eyes' eyes went wide with the sudden, final realization that his grand act of revenge was about to incinerate him too. The dynamite exploded with a deafening, gut-wrenching roar that shattered windows 3 blocks away. Smoke, dust, and debris filled the air as the corner of the schoolhouse disintegrated, burying the 3 figures under a pile of splintered wood, broken stone, and shattered plaster. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, an unnatural silence hung over Dust Creek, the kind of quiet that follows a cataclysm, a silence like a burial shroud. Then came the sounds of life returning, the coughing and crying of frightened children, the shouts of people rushing toward the wreckage. Doc Patterson reached the debris first, his medical bag already open, his old hand surprisingly strong as he began pulling away boards and chunks of mortar. "Here. They're over here." Clara emerged first, coughing, covered in a thick layer of white dust, but miraculously, shockingly alive. Ezra had taken the worst of the impact. A heavy ceiling beam lay across his back, and blood trickled from a deep gash on his head, but he was breathing. His body had created a protective pocket in the chaos, a shield that had saved both their lives. Snake Eyes Malachi wasn't so fortunate. The man who had terrorized Dust Creek for 3 long years lay motionless beneath the rubble, his reign of terror finally and irrevocably ended by his own weapon. As Doc Patterson began to work on Ezra's injuries, cutting away his shirt to assess the damage, Clara knelt beside the unconscious farmer who had sacrificed everything to save her, the children, and the town. But as she reached out to check his pulse, to feel for the reassuring beat of life, her fingers brushed against something hard beneath his shirt. It was a small, leather-wrapped object tucked into an inner pocket. Curious, she carefully pulled it out. It was a small, faded photograph, protected from the elements by its worn leather casing. The face staring back at her was one she recognized, though she had never seen it before in her life. The photograph showed a young woman with a gentle smile and familiar auburn hair. But it was the eyes that made Clara gasp, that made the world tilt on its axis. The eyes were identical to her own. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, were a few simple words, "My beloved daughter, Emma. May you find the happiness I couldn't give you. Love always, Papa." Clara's hands trembled, the photograph shaking as the impossible, earth-shattering truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random kindness from a stranger. Ezra Blackwood was her father. The man she had been told died in a tragic accident when she was just 3 years old. Doc Patterson, carefully bandaging Ezra's head wound, noticed her shock, the way she stared at the photograph as if it were a ghost. "You found it, didn't you?" he said softly. "I wondered when the truth would finally come out." "You knew?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The old doctor nodded sadly, his face etched with ancient sorrows. I delivered you, 19 years ago. Your real name isn't Clara Montgomery. It's Emma Blackwood. When your mother, Ezra's wife, died in that terrible influenza outbreak that swept through here, Ezra, he broke. He didn't think he could be a father to you. He gave you to his wife's sister, Martha Montgomery, and her husband. He changed his name, moved away, and told everyone his daughter had died with his wife in a fire. He thought you'd be safer, have a better life. At that moment, Ezra's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, clouded with pain, but then they cleared, and they focused on Clara's face, on the photograph she held in her trembling hand. Tears, clean tracks through the dust and grime on his cheeks, began to stream down his face. Emma, he whispered, the name a prayer, an apology, a lifetime of regret in a single word. Why? Clara asked, her own voice breaking, the question torn from the deepest part of her soul. Why did you let me believe you were dead? Why did you let me grow up thinking I was all alone? Ezra struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his battered body. Because I was broken, he rasped, his voice thick with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. After your mother died, after what I'd seen in the war. I was poison. I wasn't fit to raise a child. The Montgomerys, they were good people, back then. I thought you'd have a better life without me. But you've been watching me, Clara realized, the pieces falling into place. All these years. He nodded slowly, the movement pained. From a distance. When I heard what happened to the Montgomerys, when I learned about the debts, and what Snake Eyes planned to do. His voice hardened, the father's protective instinct overriding the pain. I couldn't let my failures destroy your life. Not twice. Around them, the people of Dust Creek were already beginning to rebuild, not just their schoolhouse, but their courage. Snake Eyes' remaining men had scattered to the winds after witnessing their leader's fate. For the first time in years, the sound of children playing in the street, though subdued, was not accompanied by fear. Sheriff Morrison, his badge seeming to glint a little brighter in the late afternoon sun, approached the small, wounded group. Ezra, he said, his voice full of a new, unfamiliar respect. The territorial marshal will want to speak with you about Snake Eyes' operation. Seems there's a substantial reward for information leading to the breakup of the Crimson Ridge gang. But Ezra wasn't listening. His eyes, filled with 19 years of regret and a love that had never died, were fixed on his daughter. Emma. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I can't undo the years I stole from us. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be your father again. Clara looked at this broken, battered man who had walked through hell to save her, not because she was a stranger in need, but because she was his greatest treasure. The father she had mourned for a lifetime was alive. Scarred, haunted, and flawed, but alive. My name is Clara now, she said softly. A single tear traced a path down her own dusty cheek. Clara Montgomery died in that saloon when you raised your hand. But maybe Emma Blackwood can learn to live again. As the sun began to set over Dust Creek, casting long, peaceful shadows across the reborn town, a father and a daughter, strangers and kin, walked together toward a small, lonely farmhouse on the edge of town, ready to begin the slow, painful, and beautiful work of rebuilding what had been broken, and discovering what they had both thought was lost forever. The auctioneer's hammer, a crude mallet of splintered oak, was poised to fall, a final, definitive crack that would shatter a life. In that moment, every eye in the godforsaken saloon swiveled to the back corner. A man in a weathered hat, a figure who had been little more than a shadow against the grimy wall, had just raised a calloused hand. The silence that followed was so profound, so absolute, it could have stopped a stampede cold. Inside the Red Moon Saloon in the heart of Dust Creek, the air was a thick, suffocating stew of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and a desperation so palpable it clung to the skin like a film of grease. Clara Montgomery stood on the makeshift wooden platform, a collection of hastily arranged crates that creaked with every terrified tremor that ran through her body. Her hands, white-knuckled and trembling, clutched the torn, faded fabric of her only dress. At 19, with waves of auburn hair that seemed to trap and hold the greasy lamplight, she was a splash of unwilling vibrancy in a world of muted despair. Her father, a man consumed and ultimately destroyed by the twin demons of cards and liquor, had left behind a debt that could not be paid in coin. And so, Clara was the payment. The bidding, a grunting, leering affair, had crawled its way to $30. Snake Eyes Malachi, his scarred face split by a grin that showcased a row of glinting gold teeth, was confident he'd won himself a prize. He saw her not as a person, but as property, a new bauble for his collection of ill-gotten gains. But then came that hand in the back. Ezra Blackwood hadn't spoken a single word since walking into the saloon 20 minutes earlier. He had bypassed the boisterous main room, taking his usual spot in the deep shadows of the rear corner, a place where a man could see without being seen. He had ordered a whiskey he hadn't touched, the amber liquid sitting before him like a silent accusation. From his vantage point, he watched the horror unfold with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Most folks in Dust Creek, if they thought of him at all, knew him as the hermit farmer, the quiet man who scratched a lonely existence from a plot of land 5 miles out of town. They knew him as the man who had lost his wife and daughter in a fire 3 years back, a tragedy that had burned the sociability right out of him, leaving behind a husk of a man who spoke only to his crops and his ghosts. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess, was that Clara Montgomery didn't just remind him of someone. She was a living, breathing echo of a memory he had tried to bury for 16 years. Snake Eyes Malachi's scarred face twisted into a scowl of disbelief and fury as he turned to see who dared challenge his claim. When his gaze fell upon Ezra, a laugh bubbled up from his throat like poison gas escaping a fissure in the earth. The outlaw leader controlled every crooked deal, every ounce of fear in this dusty carbuncle of a town. From the card games where aces appeared from nowhere to the protection rackets that kept honest folks cowering behind their locked doors, Snake Eyes was the sun around which Dust Creek's dark world revolved. Well, Snake Eyes drawled, his voice a blade cutting through the smoky air. Looks like the ghost farmer wants to play. Ezra stood slowly, his 6-foot frame unfolding with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent countless years working the land with his bare hands. He was lean but powerful, a man made of sinew and quiet resolve. His weathered face, a roadmap of sun and sorrow, showed no discernible emotion, but something in the depths of his eyes made the room's ambient temperature drop by 10 degrees. He reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. The sound of coins clinking together was an alien symphony in the sudden, tense quiet, each metallic note echoing off the spittoons and wooden beams. $50, he said. His voice was rusty, hoarse from long disuse, but it carried the undeniable weight of a man who meant every single word. A collective gasp, a stir of motion, rippled through the crowd. $50 was a fortune. It was more money than most of the men in that room saw in 6 months of backbreaking labor or petty crime. Clara's eyes, wide with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread, flew to this stranger. He was her potential salvation, but salvation in a place like Dust Creek often came in a form more dangerous than the original threat. Snake Eyes' smug smile evaporated. He had expected to claim his prize for a pittance, a public display of his power that would cost him next to nothing. Now, this silent, dirt-caked farmer had not only challenged him but had done so by nearly doubling the stakes. Every outlaw, every sycophant in the room, was watching, waiting to see how their leader would respond to this public humiliation. But what nobody in that saloon knew, what Snake Eyes in his arrogance could never comprehend, was that Ezra Blackwood had more than just money hidden in his past. And Snake Eyes Malachi was about to discover exactly how dangerous, how utterly lethal, a quiet man with nothing left to lose could be. Snake Eyes' fingers, thick and calloused, drummed a nervous, menacing rhythm against the worn leather of his gun belt. He studied the farmer who had so audaciously challenged him in front of his own men. In Dust Creek, respect wasn't bought with dollars, it was earned with bullets and cemented with fear. This hermit, this ghost from the plains, had just made him look weak, and weakness was a death sentence. $60, Snake Eyes countered, his voice sharp as broken glass, a clear warning to back down. But Ezra didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. $75. A murmur, louder this time, rippled through the assembled crowd. 3 months' wages for most of them, tossed around like pocket change in a high-stakes game they couldn't begin to comprehend. Clara's knees threatened to buckle. The world had shrunk to this smoky room, to the faces of these two men bidding for her soul as if she were a prize mare. Her future, her very existence, was hanging on numbers being called out in a room full of killers, drifters, and broken men. Snake Eyes' jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his scarred cheek. He controlled the silver mines that choked the hills, the brothel where hope went to die, even the town sheriff's tarnished badge, but he didn't have $75 in loose cash to waste on one girl. Not when his men were watching, their loyalty as fickle as the desert wind. His reputation was built on swift, brutal violence, not on losing bidding wars to dirt farmers. That's when Jeremiah Cross, Snake Eyes' right-hand man and a creature of pure, uncomplicated malice, leaned close. He whispered something in the outlaw leader's ear, and a cruel, cunning grin split Snake Eyes' scarred face. The tension in his posture eased, replaced by a renewed, predatory confidence. "Tell you what, farmer," Snake Eyes announced, his voice booming so everyone could hear. "Let's settle this the Dust Creek way. You and me. Outside. Right now. Winner takes the girl. Loser takes a bullet." The saloon erupted in excited shouts and the scraping of chairs. This was far better than any auction. Blood and gunpowder were the ultimate currency in this forsaken town, a spectacle that never failed to draw a crowd. Men, their faces flushed with whiskey and anticipation, scrambled toward the doors, eager to witness what they all assumed would be a swift and brutal massacre. Ezra's hand moved instinctively to his hip, and for the first time, people noticed the worn leather holster peeking from beneath his coat. It was a simple, functional piece, not the ornate, silver-studded rig favored by gunslingers like Snake Eyes. But as they looked into Ezra's eyes, they didn't see the fear they expected. Instead, there was something else entirely, a cold, unwavering calculation that made even the most hardened outlaws take an involuntary step back. "I didn't come here to kill anyone," Ezra said, his quiet voice somehow carrying over the din. "I came to buy that girl's freedom." Snake Eyes let out a laugh that was like nails on a coffin board. "Freedom, boy. The only freedom in Dust Creek comes from the barrel of a gun. You can pay with lead or gold. Makes no difference to me." But Clara had heard something in Ezra's voice that the others, in their bloodlust, had missed. It wasn't the possessive tone of a buyer or the arrogance of a challenger. It was genuine conviction. This wasn't about ownership or lust. This stranger, this quiet farmer, was willing to risk his life for her liberty, and she didn't even know his name. As the crowd surged toward the swinging saloon doors, pushing and shoving for a better view of the impending duel, Clara caught Ezra's eye for a fleeting moment. What she saw there wasn't the hunger, the predatory avarice she had learned to fear in men's faces. She saw something that stirred a deep, forgotten memory, something that reminded her of her father, long before the gambling and the drinking had hollowed him out and destroyed him. It was protection. Snake Eyes was already heading for the street, his hand resting casually on his pearl-handled Colt, confidence radiating from every swaggering step. In his 3 years of terrorizing Dust Creek, he'd never lost a gunfight. A fast draw, a steady aim, and a complete lack of conscience had kept him alive and in power. But as Ezra followed him toward those swinging doors, his movements measured and calm, Clara noticed something that made her heart skip a beat and then plummet. The farmer's right hand, the hand that would draw his weapon, was missing 2 fingers, the pinky and ring finger gone, leaving behind a scarred, incomplete grip. The remaining fingers trembled slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor as they brushed against the butt of his weapon. How could a crippled hermit, a man with a damaged hand, possibly outdraw the fastest, most ruthless gun in 3 counties? The dusty, sun-baked street outside the Red Moon Saloon became a makeshift arena. Word of the showdown spread like wildfire through Dust Creek's desolate lanes. Windows slammed open, their shutters groaning in protest. Doors creaked ajar, revealing anxious faces. Within minutes, it seemed half the town had gathered, forming a grim, silent circle to watch what everyone assumed would be Ezra Blackwood's funeral. Snake Eyes strutted into the center of the street, his silver spurs jingling with each arrogant step, savoring the attention, the fear, the power. He'd killed 12 men in formal gunfights, and their names were crudely etched into the ivory grip of his Colt-like trophies. Today, he'd add a 13th. Last chance to walk away, farmer, Snake Eyes called out, his voice dripping with the mock sympathy of a predator playing with its wounded prey. Leave your money on the ground and crawl back to your cornfield. Maybe I'll let you live to plant another season. But Ezra stepped into the street with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who had already made peace with whatever came next. The afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows that stretched between the two fighters like grasping fingers. From the saloon doorway, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Clara watched, a prisoner of the unfolding drama. That's when old Pete, the town blacksmith, a man whose opinions were as hard and unyielding as the iron he worked, shouted from the crowd, $20 says the farmer don't even clear leather. A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the spectators, but it died as quickly as it had begun when they got a closer look at Ezra's face. Those steel-gray eyes held no fear, no hesitation, just the cold, intense focus of a man who had walked this road before. Snake Eyes noticed it too, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in his armor of arrogance, crossed his features. You look familiar, farmer. We met somewhere before. Ezra's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden, absolute silence, every word carried like a thunderclap. Fort Apache. 7 years ago. You rode with the Crimson Ridge Gang. The color drained from Snake Eyes' face as if a plug had been pulled. Fort Apache had been a massacre, a brutal ambush that had left 30 U.S. cavalry soldiers dead, a military supply train looted, and all witnesses systematically eliminated. But one witness had survived. A young cavalry sergeant, wounded and left for dead among the corpses, had played dead until the raiders left. He later identified 3 of the gang members to a military tribunal, an act of courage that had led to their capture and hanging. You're him, Snake Eyes breathed, the realization dawning with icy horror. You're the soldier who testified. Ezra's damaged hand moved closer to his gun, the tremor gone, replaced by a rock-like stillness. Sergeant Ezra Blackwood. 5th Cavalry. I remember your face. You were the one who shot my commanding officer in the back while he was trying to surrender. The crowd sensed the dramatic shift in the tension. This was no longer just a gunfight over a girl in a saloon. This was a reckoning. This was about justice, revenge, and old debts that had festered for years like infected wounds. Snake Eyes' confidence shattered. If this was the same Sergeant Blackwood from Fort Apache, then the stories that had circulated among the gangs back then weren't exaggerated. The man was a legendary marksman, hardened by combat, and now fueled by a deeply personal vendetta. A fair fight suddenly seemed like suicide, and for Snake Eyes, survival had always mattered more than reputation. His eyes, desperate now, darted to his men, positioned strategically around the crowd. Clara saw it, an almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of an eyelid. That's when she realized the truth that made her blood run cold. Snake Eyes never intended to fight fair. Clara's scream tore through the air, a raw, desperate warning. Look out! On the roof! She had spotted Jeremiah Cross, raising a rifle from the flat roof of the mercantile across the street, the sun glinting off its long barrel. But her warning came a heartbeat too late. The sharp crack of the rifle split the afternoon silence. Ezra, however, didn't need the warning. He had anticipated the betrayal, his combat instincts screaming that Snake Eyes was too much of a coward to face him one-on-one. He dove sideways as the bullet meant for his back tore a chunk of wood from the hitching post behind him. The crowd scattered like startled cattle, screaming and diving for cover. The former sergeant rolled smoothly on the dusty ground, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand. He came up in a crouch, his arm extended, and fired a single, precise shot. On the roof, Jeremiah Cross jerked backward and dropped from sight with deadly precision. Snake Eyes cursed, his hand finally yanking at his own gun, but years of comfortable, corrupt living had dulled his edge. His draw was a fraction too slow. Ezra's second shot shattered the outlaw's wrist before his weapon had even cleared leather. The pearl-handled Colt, his symbol of power and death, was sent spinning uselessly into the dust. "Should have fought fair," Ezra said, advancing slowly, his gun still trained on Snake Eyes' chest. But the nightmare wasn't over. As if on cue, two more of Snake Eyes' men burst from the doors of the general store, their rifles already aimed at Ezra's exposed back. Clara watched in horror as the true nature of the trap unfolded. They hadn't just planned a sniper, they had turned the entire street into a killing field. Ezra was caught in a crossfire. That's when the impossible happened. Doc Patterson, the town's elderly, weary physician, a man who had seen too much death and had long ago retreated into a shell of quiet neutrality, stepped out from behind a water trough and into the line of fire. "Enough," he shouted, his voice cracking with age but ringing with newfound authority. He clutched his medical bag to his chest like a shield. "This man saved my grandson at Fort Apache. I was the surgeon there. I won't watch him be murdered by cowards." One by one, inspired by the old doctor's courage, other townspeople began to emerge from their hiding spots. Martha Jenkins, the formidable woman who ran the boarding house, appeared with an old shotgun. Young Tommy Wright, barely 16, held a rusty pistol. Even Sheriff Morrison, the man who had been Snake Eyes' puppet for 2 long years, slowly, hesitantly, drew his own weapon and pointed it not at Ezra, but at the remaining outlaws. "Doc's right," the sheriff said, his voice shaking but determined. "We've lived in fear long enough." Snake Eyes clutched his shattered wrist, blood seeping between his fingers, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at the rebellion unfolding before his eyes. "You fools," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "Kill me, and my brother's gang will burn this town to ash." But Ezra had heard enough. He strode forward, grabbed Snake Eyes by his blood-stained vest, and hauled him upright, pressing the warm barrel of his Colt against the outlaw's temple. "Your brother's dead. Hung for murder in Tombstone last month. I should know. I was there to watch." The lie came so smoothly, so convincingly, that even Clara believed it. She could see the cold calculation in Ezra's eyes. He wasn't just stating a fact, he was severing the final thread of fear. He was buying them time, breaking Snake Eyes' psychological hold over the town by destroying the myth of his invincibility. Snake Eyes' remaining men looked at each other, their rifles wavering. Their leader was beaten, his power broken. And backup wasn't coming. Without their boss's fearsome reputation to hide behind, they were just common thugs facing an entire armed and angry town.